I was frozen when I took my in-laws out to lunch at a restaurant and found my wife and her lover together at the next table. I was speechless, but then my in-laws saw me and I went to her and her lover's table and said, "You have just destroyed our family and you have broken your parents' trust because they are here and they saw you and this man together. You only show up at my house to get your things and the divorce papers." She was desperate and insisted on coming back with me, but it was too late. And then she realized what she had done. At that moment, my soul left my body. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet and I was floating in a vacuum of disbelief, as if it had all been a joke in poor taste, as if there had been some camera hidden behind a decorative plant in the restaurant recording the cruelest moment of my life. I could still hear my in-laws' voices, choked with disbelief, calling their daughter's name as if saying it would be enough to make her go back to being who they had raised her to be. But she didn't respond. Her eyes were wide open, and her hand resting on the man's in front of her remained there for seconds that seemed eternal, until she realized that we were seeing her. Until her gaze met mine, and she tried to pull her hand back, too late, as if she wanted to undo what was already eternally engraved in our memories. I walked toward their table, my heart beating like a war drum, but my voice came out cold, steady, almost calm. There was no more screaming in me, only the death of everything we had once built together. The words I said in front of everyone in the restaurant were not premeditated, they were spat out from my shattered chest, like shrapnel from a silent bomb. "You have just destroyed our family and you have just broken the trust of your parents. They are here and they saw you with this man. Come to our house only to get your things and the divorce papers." I don't remember if the people around me stopped eating, if the waiter froze with the tray in his hand, if the background music stopped, but everything stopped for me. She tried to mumble something like, "It's not what it seems," but her mouth was shaking more than her voice. And in that moment, on her parents' faces, I saw the breaking of something sacred. It was a silence that killed any defense she could offer. And when I turned my back, something inside her finally understood that there was no turning back. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent hours pacing from one room in the house to another, the silence echoing louder than any argument. I picked up old photos, forgotten letters, love notes scribbled on coffee napkins, memories that once warmed me and now burned me like acid. The smell of her pillow disgusted me. Her voice in old messages on my phone sounded like a lie. Her smile in travel videos, like an act. Everything, absolutely everything, now tasted like poison. How could she? How could someone who shared my dreams, my body, my life, be able to look me in the eyes days before, smile and tell me she loved me, and yet sit in a restaurant holding hands with another man, as if she were free, as if I had never existed? Cheating is a slow death, and the worst part is that you survive it. And then the phone calls started. She called, texted, cried on the voice memos. She said she had made a mistake, that it was a phase, that it was just a one-night stand, that it was a mix-up, that she didn't want to lose our story. With each message from her, my nausea grew. Because what hurt wasn't the physical betrayal, it was the planning. The time she chose, the restaurant she chose, the reservation she made, the perfume she wore, the lingerie she chose, the kiss on the cheek she gave me before leaving, saying she was going to visit a friend. Every detail showed that she wanted it. She chose to hurt me. And now, after being caught, after seeing her own parents' faces crumble in disappointment, did she want to go back? No. There was no more room. But what she never anticipated was the real weight of her choices. When she tried to return to her parents' house, they greeted her with a look I never imagined coming from them: shame. They loved her, of course, but at that moment, love was not enough to forgive. Her mother cried silently, looking out the window, and her father simply said he needed time. She stood in the hall, with her bags in her hands and her eyes swollen, waiting for a hug that never came. Her parents moved to another city a few days later, without warning. They left only a note: "We need to breathe. Take care of yourself." She began to waste away. I know this because, even though I didn't look for her, people came up to me. Mutual friends, neighbors, gym acquaintances. Have you seen how thin she is? It looks like she's given up everything, even her job. They say the guy she was seen with has disappeared. And that's when I knew that even her lover, her great fleeting love, had abandoned her. She was left alone. And loneliness, that silent companion, began to eat her up inside. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening to me. I began to feel peace. At first, it was just the absence of pain. Then, it was a pleasant silence. Then, it was freedom. One day I woke up and realized that the bed was not empty, it was whole. It was not a lack, it was space. I started running in the morning, I started reading again, cooking, playing the guitar. One day I went to the market and met a look. A shy smile. A good morning. No rush. No hidden intentions. No lies. It was just a good morning. But with that smile, for the first time, my chest didn't hurt. She still tried to come back. A year later, she knocked on the door of the house where we lived together, now empty, with a letter in her hands and tears in her eyes. She said she had written everything she felt, that she now understood. She wanted to give me the letter, but I didn't take it. I just said, "It's too late now." And I turned my back, leaving her there. Not out of revenge. But because the time for pain had passed. I forgave her, but I never wanted to go back. And she finally realized the value of what she had destroyed. The pain was not the end. It was the beginning. And the most curious thing of all is that, years later, I discovered a detail that she never knew I knew. Something that would change the way you see this whole story. Because, deep down, this betrayal began long before that restaurant table. And the reason behind it all, wasn't just desire. It wasn't just need. It was something much deeper, darker, and absolutely devastating. But this was only revealed when least expected. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, encourage or romanticize cheating, never. All the stories you will hear are fictional, but based on real situations that show how much betrayal is devastating, destroys families, erodes trust and leaves deep scars. The moral of these stories is clear: every choice has a price. Now, take a deep breath. Get ready to hear an intense, impactful and unforgettable story. Because what you're going to hear now will mess with you. They met on a gray Saturday, one of those when the weather seems to be undecided as to whether it will rain or just threaten to. There was no music playing, and no romantic mood in the air. It was in the supermarket, among the shelves of cleaning products, that Daniel and Laura's eyes met for the first time. He, recently separated, with his heart still tied to old guilt, was trying to reorganize a lonely life. She, engaged in an unstable relationship, was looking for simple distractions to postpone decisions she knew she would need to make. The encounter was brief, without much exchange, but something remained. Days later, fate decided to cross their paths again, this time at a bakery in the neighborhood, and what was a coincidence turned into conversation, then coffee, then routine. 3 months later, Laura ended the engagement, and 6 months after that, they were already living under the same roof. Daniel was a methodical man, so detail-oriented that it was annoying, but not out of coldness, but out of zeal. He was the kind of man who remembered his mother-in-law's birthday, who wrote down the date of their first kiss and who put notes in Laura's pockets with phrases like, "Thank you for existing." Working as a systems analyst, he maintained a stable, predictable routine, and although this seemed boring to some, for her it was synonymous with security. Laura came from a troubled family, with parents who had been divorced since she was young, and she grew up amidst conflicts, broken promises and noisy silences. When she found that calm haven in Daniel, she felt she could finally rest. And in the first few years, she really did rest. The wedding was celebrated with a small but elegant ceremony. A well-kept garden, white flowers and a clear sky like you rarely see. Daniel cried during the vows. So did Laura. Her parents, somewhat skeptical at first, were moved to see her so serene. And there, in that storybook setting, was born what seemed like a perfect story. They weren't a social media couple. There were no public declarations or exaggerated displays of happiness. Their complicity was in small gestures. In the messages during work hours, in Sunday morning coffees, in the nights when they shared a bottle of wine while listening to jazz without saying a word. When they bought their own house, a discreet but cozy building, they celebrated alone, on the floor of the still unfurnished living room, eating cold pizza straight from the box. There they promised to make that space a home where respect would always come before routine, and where love would be more than a physical presence, it would be an emotional permanence. Little by little, they decorated every corner with their identity. Daniel's books took up half of the bookshelf, while the paintings that Laura painted in her free time began to occupy the walls. Plants, blankets, candles, the scent of lavender. It was the kind of house that embraced whoever entered. Life was peaceful. Maybe too much so. Daniel worked from home 3 times a week, which meant he spent most of his time in the office upstairs. Laura, who had left her job at a home decor store to dedicate herself to a small studio, also spent most of the day at home. Their time together was constant, but not suffocating. They learned to respect each other's silence, to understand bad days, to deal with fatigue without exploding. They didn't argue over trivial matters, and when they disagreed, they knew how to listen. There was a kind of maturity there that made many couples envious. Laura's friends would comment on how she seemed to have hit the jackpot. "He's a real find," they would say. And she would smile, not because she was bragging, but because deep down, she knew it was true. Daniel was kind without being cheesy, firm without being authoritarian, sensitive without ceasing to be rational. And she admired him deeply for that. Laura's parents gradually began to accept Daniel as part of the family. Her father-in-law, a quiet and serious man, began to open up more when he noticed the respect his son-in-law had for his daughter. Her mother-in-law, an observant woman, discreetly praised his gestures, how he served Laura first, how he pulled out her chair for her, how he listened attentively when she spoke. They had lunch together once a month, without exaggeration, but consistently. It was a tradition that Laura made a point of maintaining, as an attempt to restore some family harmony. And Daniel never objected. On the contrary, he was the one who remembered the date of the next meetings, who chose the wines and looked for the best restaurants, always attentive to each person's tastes and restrictions. Deep down, he knew that winning over her parents was also a way of ensuring that she felt safe. But time, that cruel sculptor, carves cracks in even the most resistant marble. And what began as a story of rescue and peace, gradually became an overly careful routine. Predictability, once a comfort, began to seem like an absence of surprises. Laura, who had always had a restless soul, began to miss something she couldn't name. Painting no longer fulfilled her as it once did. The studio, although it gave her pleasure, began to seem like a lukewarm refuge. The colors in the paintings became colder, the lines more imprecise. Daniel didn't notice right away. "I was involved in a new project, and my head was spinning with deadlines, reports and graphs." But even when he did notice, he attributed it to the natural ups and downs of life. After all, who doesn't go through moments of boredom? Laura, on the other hand, didn't know how to express what she felt without seeming ungrateful. She knew she had a good man by her side. She knew that many would give anything to have the stability she had. And so she kept quiet. She hid her restlessness behind polite smiles, and when she felt suffocated, she told herself it was just a phase. She tried to rekindle her enthusiasm with short weekend trips, improvised dinners, new recipes. Daniel, always participatory, entered into ideas lightly, but she noticed that he seemed to do everything more out of love for her than genuine enthusiasm. And perhaps that was what disturbed her, the fact that he was always willing, even when she was no longer sure if she wanted him to be. The marriage entered a silent mode of stable coexistence, where kisses still existed, but were automatic. Hugs continued, but were rare. Conversations decreased in intensity, although they were always respectful. And sex, although present, no longer had the same heat as it had in the beginning. There was no crisis. There was no shouting. Just a warm breeze that hung over everything. And this confused Laura. She wondered if it was normal. If every mature relationship was like this. If it was love or just a well-cultivated habit. And in this doubt, she began to lose herself. One night, while Daniel slept beside her, she lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling. She didn't cry, but she couldn't sleep either. Her head was buzzing with thoughts, memories, possibilities. She wanted to feel something that would wake her up, but she didn't know what. Her body was there, but her soul seemed to hover meters away. And when she got up, barefoot, and went to the kitchen to drink water, she looked out the window and saw herself reflected in the glass. That image frightened her. Because she no longer recognized herself. And then, something changed. Not overnight. But through small gestures, small internal concessions, small gaps that slowly opened up. And what was once a stable, admired and envied marriage began to be crossed by something invisible but powerful. It wasn't something that could be said out loud, nor something that Laura understood immediately. But she felt it. And what she would do with that feeling would change the course of their lives forever. They just didn't know it yet. Little by little, the gaps began to grow inside Laura like small cracks in a well-painted wall. No one notices them at first, but one day the plaster gives way. The mornings no longer had the same calm rhythm as before. Daniel continued with his kind gestures, the notes on the table, the coffee ready, but she received them with a kind of emotional anesthesia. She began to respond with short smiles, tasteless kisses, hurried words. Her body remained there, but her gaze wandered further and further away. Inside herself, Laura fought a silent battle between guilt and the lack of passion. He knew he was moving away, but he didn't know how to go back. She felt ungrateful for wanting more when she had so much, but she also felt a growing restlessness, a lukewarm fire that burned but would not light. She started leaving the house more often under trivial pretexts. A trip downtown to get painting materials would stretch on for hours. A coffee with a friend would turn into an entire afternoon out. Daniel didn't question her. He was never the controlling type. He trusted. He believed. And that, instead of comforting her, put even more pressure on her. How could she be hiding something from someone who didn't even doubt her? His silence was a mirror, and all she saw reflected was her own deviation from the path they had built together. But she kept going. Insecure, lost, still not understanding exactly where it was taking her. It was during an art exhibition that she met the man who, without knowing it, would destroy the foundation of her life. He was there, observing her paintings with attentive eyes, asking about techniques, tones, about what she felt when she painted. Laura felt, for the first time in a long time, that someone was looking at her with eyes of genuine curiosity. And this, which seemed so simple, ignited something inside her that had long been dormant. They exchanged few words at that first meeting. But he appeared again, at another smaller exhibition, and then another. Their encounters became habitual, but unplanned. At least at first. Then, they became messages. A compliment about the color of a painting. A question about where she bought her brushes. A suggestion for coffee. And then, coffee. She told herself it was just friendship. That it was harmless. That there was no harm in talking to someone who appreciated her art. But there was. And she knew it. Because with every text she replied with a smile, with every glance that lingered a second too long, with every accidental touch, a thread in the fabric of her marriage was being cut. And yet, she kept going. Because in that space between guilt and desire, she felt alive. And that, for her in that moment, was stronger than any vows from the past. Daniel remained oblivious. His days were filled with spreadsheets, meetings, and lovingly prepared dinners. He still believed that Laura was just going through a difficult phase that would soon pass. Sometimes, he noticed that she took longer to respond to messages. That she seemed distracted during dinner. That she spent more time on her cell phone than before. But he preferred to trust. He preferred to believe that it was all in his head. That years of love and companionship couldn't fall apart because of something invisible. Until the lies began. Laura began to invent commitments. She used the names of friends as alibis. She created fictitious situations to justify going out. And with each lie, she lost a piece of herself. When she looked into Daniel's eyes before leaving the house, she felt the weight of a growing abyss. He said, "I love you," with the same tenderness as always. And she answered, but her voice faltered. Not for lack of love, perhaps, but because the love was no longer whole. It was fragmented, torn, suspended. She slept next to a man who knew her fears, her quirks, her preferences, and yet, he desired another. And this duality tore her apart. Over time, their encounters with each other became more frequent. It was no longer just a coffee. It was no longer just a conversation. They began to see each other in hidden places, at different times, in the shadows of everyday life. And Laura, immersed in the vertigo of the forbidden, let herself be carried away. There was passion, there was intensity, there was everything she missed, or thought she missed. But there was also fear. Dread. Because deep down, she knew she was playing with something sacred. That she had crossed a line from which she could no longer return. Daniel finally noticed something different. One night, when he hugged her, he felt her stiffen. There was no reciprocity. There was no surrender. He looked into her eyes and asked, softly, if everything was okay. She answered yes, that she was just tired. But there was something in her voice that he had never heard before, absence. And that was when he started to notice. The schedules, the short answers, the eyes that avoided his, the cell phone that she never put down. He started to put the pieces together. But still, he wanted to believe that it was just stress, exhaustion, a phase. That was when Laura's mother called. She wanted to arrange a family lunch, and suggested a new restaurant in town. Daniel thought it was a good idea. Maybe it would be good for Laura to get out, see her parents, and disconnect. She hesitated, but ended up accepting. The following Saturday, she dressed more carefully than usual, said she needed to stop by a place before lunch to take care of something quick and that she would meet them there. Daniel, curious, asked if she wanted to go with them, but she declined with a vague smile. He said it was just a quick delivery of materials. And she went alone. At the restaurant, he arrived with his in-laws a few minutes before the agreed time. They chose a quiet table in the corner, ordered appetizers, and chatted. The atmosphere was light. Until, while reading the menu, Daniel saw a reflection in the mirror at the back of the room. A couple. The woman had a very familiar hand movement. He looked again. Blinked. Slowly looked back. And his heart stopped for a second. It was Laura. Sitting, smiling, wearing the same dress she had been wearing that morning, holding the hand of a man he had never seen before. Time froze. There was no immediate anger. No shouting. Just silence. An internal explosion of everything he believed to be true. His in-laws realized something was wrong when he turned pale. They followed his gaze. And saw. What happened next was a blur in her memory. Daniel stood up. He walked over to her table. And when Laura's eyes met his, panic spread across her face. The man in front of her took his hand off hers, embarrassed, but it was too late. With a firm, low voice, Daniel spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't dramatize. He said enough. He said the essential. And then he turned his back. He left her there, with her parents who had seen everything, with her lover who lowered his eyes, with the weight of all the lies and with the abyss she had dug herself. As he walked out the door of the restaurant, Daniel knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But what he didn't know yet, was that that moment would only reveal part of the truth. The darkest part was yet to come. The days that followed lunch were enveloped in a silence so thick that it seemed to weigh on the shoulders of everyone involved. Daniel left the house key on the kitchen table, gathered a few clothes and documents, and left without looking back. There was nothing more to be said, he thought. Everything had already been exposed, everything had already fallen apart. He didn't want explanations, justifications, or tears. He wanted distance. The wound was still too fresh, and each image of that scene, the hand on the other's, the knowing smile, her shock upon seeing him, repeated in his mind like a continuous torture. In the absence of answers, Daniel sought refuge in a simple hotel, far from the center, where he could exist without being noticed. There, he spent his days aimlessly, avoiding his phone, ignoring messages, and trying not to drown in the unbearable mix of anger, pain, and disappointment. He didn't want to know why. But the why came, like a persistent whisper, a silent voice that throbbed in the back of his neck. Why did she do that? What was missing? What didn't he see? What wasn't enough? Laura, on the other hand, was plunged into a despair she had never experienced before. She knew she would lose Daniel at that moment, but she had no idea she would lose so much so quickly. Her parents, horrified by what they had witnessed, decided to cut off contact. Her mother no longer returned her calls, and her father, dryly, simply sent a message saying that they were going on an indefinite trip and that it would be better for her to find herself alone, since she had chosen to be like this. The man she had been with, the one she had let herself be carried away by, disappeared as easily as he had appeared. There were no confrontations, no promises. Just a convenient disappearance after the scandal. And Laura, for the first time in years, felt deprived of any support. She thought she could pick up the pieces, start over, explain, convince. But now, with empty hands, there was no one to explain to. The house was cold, the rooms seemed too big, and the objects that had once told her story with Daniel had become relics of a life she had destroyed with her own hands. It was only after a week that she found the courage to write. Not a message, but a letter. A long, handwritten page, each word of which seemed to scratch the paper with the guilt she carried. She did not beg for forgiveness, she knew that luxury was no longer hers, but she needed to say something she had kept inside for too long, something that even she had buried deep in layers of denial. The letter was short, direct, but full of weight. And in it, there was a single sentence that would change everything. If I could go back in time, I would have told you what I discovered that day, the day I went to the hospital alone. When Daniel received the letter, 10 days had already passed. He had no intention of opening it. He left the envelope on the table for 2 whole days, untouched, as if he were afraid to touch it and unearth pain that was beginning to calcify. But one morning, between insomnia and the bitterness of silence, he decided to rip the seal. The first words did not surprise him. They were remorse, confession, despair. Until he reached the final part, the only one that made his breath catch. I was going to tell you. I promise I would. But after I found out, I was so afraid of losing you that I preferred to wallow in the mistake, as if that would protect me from what was really destroying me. Daniel stood still for minutes. Hospital. Discovery. What could possibly justify something so devastating? The letter ended with a request to meet him, a last chance for an explanation, not reconciliation. She knew that winning back that love was a mirage, but she desperately needed him to know what had happened before the end. Against all instincts, he decided to go. Not for her. But because doubt was eating away at him. And deep down, no matter how much he tried to deny it, there was still an echo of feeling, a remnant of the past, pulsing. They met in a discreet park, late in the afternoon. She was sitting on a bench, her eyes marked by sleepless nights, her face pale, her hair tied up haphazardly. When she saw him, she stood up slowly, as if she were afraid of breaking her own body. Daniel stood, motionless, waiting. She began to speak in a low, trembling voice, not daring to look him in the eye. She said that 2 months earlier she had felt unusual pain, persistent dizziness, and unusual bleeding. She didn't want to worry Daniel, so she made an appointment on her own. At the hospital, she underwent tests and then a biopsy. The diagnosis was not serious, but what they revealed shook her to the ground. When analyzing the exams, the doctor revealed that Laura had undergone a surgical procedure years ago, long before she met Daniel, which had caused serious complications in her ability to get pregnant. There were internal adhesions, uterine lesions, and a very high risk of permanent infertility. She was in shock. Everything she knew about her body seemed to have changed. The doctor explained that if she wanted to try to have children, she would need to act quickly and with continuous monitoring. But the problem was not only medical. It was psychological, emotional. At that moment, Laura was faced with the reality that she might never be able to give Daniel what he so desired and that she always spoke about with shining eyes: a family, children, a full house. Then she froze. She didn't tell him. She buried the news inside herself like someone swallowing a thorn. And that was the breaking point. She began to pull away, feeling incomplete, guilty, broken. The betrayal wasn't planned, it started as an escape, an outlet for the panic that was consuming her. It wasn't love, or passion. It was just desperation disguised as impulse. She wanted to feel something that would make her forget that she was failing the man who had loved her the most. But she failed at everything. She hid what needed to be said, destroyed what could be repaired. And now, here she was, stripped of her vanity, in front of him, asking him to listen, not to accept. Daniel listened to her in silence. His eyes fixed on hers, expressionless, without tears. Inside him, a whirlwind was forming. He didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal, or knowing that she had gone through all of that alone, when all he wanted was to build a life with her. He murmured, in a low, almost imperceptible voice, "Why didn't you tell me?" She replied through her tears that she was afraid. Afraid of disappointing him, of seeing him leave, of him looking at her and seeing someone defective. She preferred to be a traitor than to be weak. And now she was both. The silence between them dragged on. Laura waited for a reaction. But Daniel just nodded slowly. He said he was sorry for her, for everything she had lived in silence. But he was also sorry that she had thought he would not love her even in this condition. What had destroyed them was not infertility. It was the lie. Her fear had killed what could still be rebuilt. And now, even if she healed, even if her body blossomed again, there was a land between them too barren for any new seed. She tried to get closer, but he backed away. He said he needed peace, and that he finally understood something: love does not survive where silence is chosen. He turned and walked away. And in that moment, Laura realized that the cruelest weight was not that of abandonment. It was the regret of not having trusted the love she had. Because now, she knew, and it was too late. Daniel walked aimlessly through the empty streets, his steps hurried as if he wanted to free himself from the weight his body was carrying, the body that now seemed to no longer belong to him. Laura's revelation still echoed like a muffled thunder inside his chest. The pain of betrayal still burned, but now it shared space with something deeper, darker, something that had no name, only presence. Her confession had dismantled everything. Not just his marriage, not just the image he had of the woman he had shared years of his life with, but also the image he had of himself as a man, as a partner, as someone he thought had been enough for her to trust. He no longer knew at what point along the way he had lost the chance to avoid all of this. But what corroded him the most now was the fact that, even after the fall, he could still feel something. It was no longer love, but it was not hate either. It was an insistent reminder of what had once been beautiful. And that hurt more than any cry of revolt. The following week, he rented a small apartment in another neighborhood, further away, where he didn't have to cross paths with familiar faces, where he could start over without the constant reminder of the hallways of the house they had decorated together. He began to lead a silent life, between work and short walks at dusk. The nights were the hardest. The silence there was more aggressive, more charged. He avoided photos, avoided opening old boxes, avoided anything that could, in some way, remind him of her. And yet, she was in everything. In the coffee cup, in the fold of the sheet, in the way he still left space on the bed, as if unconsciously waiting for someone to lie down there. Laura, on the other hand, turned her loneliness into penance. In the days that followed the encounter in the park, she remained in the empty house, wandering like a ghost. She no longer turned on the television, she didn't paint, she didn't eat properly. The paintings were turned against the wall, one by one, as if her art were not worth seeing. The plants withered. The mirror in the living room was covered with a sheet. She slept little and badly, and when she did, she dreamed of the life she had destroyed. The neighbors began to comment. "She seems like a different person. Have you seen the state she's in? They say her husband has left for good." The words were whispered, but they hit like hammer blows. One rainy afternoon, she decided to write again. Not a letter to Daniel, she no longer had that right. But to her own parents. She hadn't heard from them in weeks. She wrote with trembling hands, trying to find words that didn't sound like apologies, but rather like pleas for understanding. She didn't expect forgiveness, she just wanted them to know that she was getting better, or at least trying to. The reply came a few days later. Short. Formal. "We're fine. We hope you'll be fine too." That was enough to tell her that the bridge was still burning, that the bonds were too fragile to be pulled. Still, she felt she needed to do more. That she needed to get out of that suffocating space, filled with the shadows of a life that no longer existed. The following month, she put the house up for sale. She spent weeks packing up her belongings, donating furniture, cleaning every corner as if she wanted to cover her tracks. When everything was almost ready to leave, she found a small box in the back of a closet. Inside were old notes from Daniel. "You are my home," one of them read. The tears came silently, and for the first time in weeks, she couldn't hold them back. She sat on the cold floor of the empty room and cried until there was nothing left. And there, amid the boxes and the dust, she understood that her regret was not just for having lost Daniel, but for having lost herself, for having allowed fear to make decisions for her, for having remained silent when love could still be saved with an honest conversation. Meanwhile, Daniel was slowly getting his life back on track. Not like someone who had overcome it, but like someone who had learned to breathe again. It was on one of those late afternoons, in a small bookstore where he used to go with Laura, that he met Clara. She was in the romance section, leafing through a book with curious eyes. They exchanged glances, then words, then smiles. It was a light conversation, without expectations, but that somehow brought a breath of normality. They met up again, always without rushing. Clara was sweet, direct, intelligent. She had been through a betrayal years ago and knew the bitter taste of loss. And it was precisely this silent understanding that brought the two together. There were no demands, no promises. Just company. And that, at that moment, was enough. On a sunny Sunday, as they walked through the park, Clara held his hand for the first time. Daniel felt a new warmth. It wasn't euphoria, nor was it immediate enchantment. It was peace. And he realized that perhaps there, in that simple gesture, there was room for a new beginning. They began to see each other more often, sharing secrets, movies, coffees. And Daniel, who thought he had closed his heart forever, began to realize that loving again was not betraying the past, but honoring it with courage. It was during this period that a mutual friend of Laura and Daniel decided to look for him. She was carrying an envelope that Laura had left for her, asking her to deliver it if she found it. Daniel hesitated, but accepted. Inside, there was a single photo, him and Laura laughing in the kitchen, still in paint-stained clothes, on the day they painted the living room for the first time. On the back, a handwritten phrase, "You were my home, even when I didn't know how to live in myself." He kept the photo, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that, despite everything, love existed. And that, as much as it hurt, also freed him. In the last week before Laura handed over the keys to the house, she decided to make one last visit to the garden. The flowers were neglected, but they still held up. She walked among them as if she were saying goodbye to a part of herself. And there, sitting on the stone bench that she and Daniel had bought together, she finally understood that it wasn't the end that destroyed her, but omission. That her mistake wasn't being imperfect, but not trusting enough to share that imperfection with the one who loved her. That night, for the first time, she slept peacefully. She knew she would never get Daniel back. But knowing that he was okay, that he had moved on, gave her a spark of serenity. Maybe one day, far in the future, they would cross paths again. Maybe not. But she had finally learned to accept the voids without trying to fill them urgently. And in that silent learning, she found what she had been looking for all along, herself. Daniel, looking out the window of his new apartment, with Clara sleeping next to him, took a deep breath. The world was not fixed, but it was at peace. And that was all he needed. The months that followed the revelation brought an unexpected stillness, as if the world had finally let out its breath after being held between its teeth for so long. There were no more secrets to be revealed, nor any more confrontations to happen. The words were spoken, the silences broke through the skin, and what remained now was the reconstruction of pieces, done patiently, in silence and without promises of going back to how it was before. Daniel, although he remained discreet in his feelings, felt a subtle difference in his daily life. The weight that had previously crushed his chest had given way to an uncomfortable lightness, like someone carrying an empty suitcase after years of dragging a burden. Clara was there, with a sweet and firm presence, but she did not try to occupy spaces that were not hers. She understood Daniel's silences, accepted the days when he withdrew into himself, and offered company without invading. It was a relationship of exchange and respect, built with delicacy and care, without rushing, and perhaps that is why it worked. One night, after a simple candlelit dinner, Clara spoke about the past, about losses, and about the strange feeling of starting over when you still carry scars that have barely healed. Daniel listened to her in silence, but there was understanding in his eyes. They both knew that they were together not because they wanted to forget what they had experienced, but because they had decided not to let the past define what they could still experience. Still, Daniel felt that there was something open, a last piece that had not fit together, something that needed to be done not to resume what had already happened, but to finally put an end to the story that was worthy of the story he had lived. It was as if something deep inside him was asking for a gesture, a true goodbye, something that would bring the cycle to a fair end. And he knew exactly what it was. He spent days thinking about whether or not he should write. Not a response to the letter Laura had left with her friend, but something of his own, something that would allow him to say everything that had been stuck between his teeth when he turned his back on her in the park. Not to offer reconciliation, much less to reopen wounds, but to name what he felt. The letter was written in a silent dawn, without interruptions. It was not long, nor was it overly sentimental. It was honest. It told of the days that followed the breakup, of the process of relearning to live alone, of the pain he felt when he discovered that love was not enough to prevent destruction. He also spoke of his gratitude for the good years, of the importance Laura had had in his development as a man, and of the relief he felt when he finally understood that forgiving did not mean accepting, but moving on without carrying the hate. He ended the letter with a dry sentence, but full of meaning: "Today, I can remember you without hurting." And that is freedom. Laura received the letter on a gray afternoon, already living in a new, small, simple apartment, decorated with neutral colors and new paintings that she had painted recently. It was a new phase, a new life, marked not by Daniel's absence, but by the full presence of herself. When she read the letter, she didn't cry. She smiled. Because finally, she felt that she had closed a cycle. Daniel no longer blamed her. And that, more than any accepted apology, was what I needed most. She kept the letter between the pages of a notebook, and that night, she painted a canvas like she hadn't done in a long time. The colors were bright, the lines firm. It was as if, with each brushstroke, she was sealing an invisible wound, as if telling herself that she was ready to start, this time with her own feet on the ground. Meanwhile, the relationship between Daniel and Clara evolved steadily, but humanly. They weren't perfect. They argued over small things, had differences, talked about fears and carried stories of pain. But there was respect in every word, care in every gesture. Daniel, although he still kept quiet a few times, felt he could trust her. There were nights when Clara would listen to him tell details of his past with Laura without judgment, just listening, and in those moments, he realized how rare it was to find someone who understood that loving someone with wounds is not an easy task, but it is possible when there is a willingness to see beyond the scars. Laura, in turn, had gradually re-established her ties with her parents. It wasn't easy. Their conversations were short, full of awkward pauses. But time, which dilutes even the deepest hurts, began to soften the edges. Her mother started calling to see how she was doing, to ask about her paintings and her plans. Her father, more reserved, sent short but present messages. Little by little, the visits returned. At first, they were brief, then longer. There was awkwardness, yes. But there was also a mutual desire to start over. Laura now understood that not all reconstructions start from scratch, some need to happen from the rubble. One afternoon, when she was visiting a local bookstore to look for references for her paintings, Laura bumped into a child who was running between the shelves. When she looked up to apologize, she found Daniel. He was there, next to Clara, holding a book in his hands. The look between them was quick, but full of layers. There was no tension, no resentment. Just a calm recognition, like someone who had already read that chapter and understood every line. Clara, noticing the mood, politely extended her hand to Laura. She responded with a firm, mature shake. They exchanged light words, talked about art and literature, and after a few minutes, they went their separate ways. Daniel looked back for a brief second and saw Laura disappear between the shelves. He felt something similar to peace. There was no longer the weight of the past there. Only the certainty that everything that needed to be said had already been said. That night, while Clara was cooking and Daniel was organizing some papers on the desk, he found the old photograph again, the one Laura had left. He thought about throwing it away, but when he looked once more at the smile on the face of the person who had once been his world, he decided to keep it, not as a regret, but as part of his journey. There was no more anger there, only memory. An understanding that was perhaps his greatest liberation. Laura was also writing, this time for herself. A diary, where she recorded not only events, but feelings, reflections. She was writing about how silence can be cruel, but also necessary. About how the truth sets you free, even when it hurts. About how betrayal destroys, but forgiveness, even if unilateral, builds bridges to your own future. She didn't know if she would ever love anyone again, and for now, that didn't even matter. What mattered was having loved herself again. And that, for someone who had spent so much time denying herself, was a huge victory. In one of her last therapy sessions, Laura told her psychologist that she had briefly met Daniel again. She talked about his smile, about how light he seemed. The therapist asked her how she felt. Laura thought for a moment and answered with a simple sentence, I felt proud. Because even after everything, he didn't let himself get hardened. And neither did I. For the first time in a long time, she felt that her story, although marked by profound mistakes, would not end in failure. Instead, it would end in a learning experience that was costly, but worth every second of maturity achieved. Daniel, now calmer, no longer sought explanations in every corner of his mind. He accepted that life is made up of phases, some short, some long, but all necessary. He knew that the story with Laura was not a mistake, but a journey. And that Clara did not come to replace anyone, but to open a new chapter, written in other words, in a different tune. They began to plan small things, like a trip, maybe a course together, who knows, in the future, even a shared home. But everything was done calmly. Because when you know the taste of what you lost, you learn to value every crumb of what you have. And so, between silent goodbyes and unexpected reunions, the pieces began to fall into place. Not like a happy ending, but like a true new beginning. Where each character understood their role, took on their part and, above all, decided not to repeat the same script. Because sometimes, the only way to rewrite your own story, is by having the courage to end the previous one in the most honest way possible. The weeks passed slowly and silently, like a fine rain that doesn't soak, but wets everything continuously and discreetly. Daniel spent less and less time thinking about the past. There was no longer a constant need to understand the reasons, nor the urgency to forgive. Memories emerged like distant echoes, without the same strength as before. It was no longer about Laura, it was about him. About recovering the man who had been buried under frustration and astonishment. He was more attentive to himself, more sensitive to the way the world seemed new to him, even though it was familiar. And it was precisely this rediscovery of himself that made him see Clara with different eyes, not as someone looking to fill an empty space, but as someone wanting to open new spaces where there had never been. Love, when reborn after a great loss, has a bittersweet flavor, more mature, calmer. And Clara knew this. She didn't pressure, didn't ask too much, didn't demand what could not yet be completely given. She was simply there, available, whole, sincere. And Daniel was beginning to understand the value of this. One night, after dinner at a small restaurant where the aroma of herbs mingled with the discreet sound of the piano in the background, Clara brought up a subject that Daniel still avoided naturally, like someone touching a wound with light fingers. She spoke about reconstruction. She said that sometimes, loving someone who was hurt required attentive silence. Not a passive silence, but one that welcomed. Daniel looked at her with moist eyes, not knowing how to express how much that presence was what he didn't know he needed. We don't need to run anywhere, Daniel. We just need to walk in the same direction, she said, as she ran her finger around the rim of her wine glass. He smiled, without saying anything. Sometimes, love showed itself in those simple phrases, said at the right moment. And in that moment, he knew that even though there were still ghosts along the way, they were no longer whispering. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Laura allowed herself to return to places she had previously avoided. She went to the art gallery where she had last exhibited her work before everything fell apart. She walked among the paintings like any other visitor, but there was something different in her eyes. She was not seeking recognition or nostalgia. She was simply observing. The gallery director recognized her and invited her to talk. Laura, hesitantly, accepted. They sat in the back of the room, among old catalogs and future projects. They talked about art, about new beginnings, about how time rearranges priorities. The director asked if she still painted. Laura said yes, but only for herself. Maybe it's time to go back to the world, said the other, smiling. Laura laughed shyly, but took the idea home with her. Over the next few nights, she went through her notebooks, her sketches, her unfinished drafts. She realized that there was still much to say. And that perhaps, by showing her art, she could also tell her story without needing words. With this timid impulse, she began working on a new series. More sober colors, more abstract but intense shapes. There were no laments on the canvases, but there were scars, some still open, others carefully closed. With each brushstroke, Laura tried to express what she had never been able to verbalize clearly: regret, guilt, but also learning. Painting was, for her, a way of existing with dignity, even after having made mistakes. It was a way of rebuilding, without denying what had been lost. One afternoon, Daniel received an invitation from the gallery. The new exhibition was called Fragments of Silence. The name caught his attention. He turned the card over in his hands for a few minutes, and only then did he notice the small signature in the lower corner. Laura. He hesitated for days, leaving the invitation on the table like someone trying to decide whether to open a door they might not want to go through. But on the day of the opening, after leaving work early, he decided to go. Clara was aware. They talked about it with the maturity of someone building something solid. If you feel like you need to go, then go. Sometimes, some answers are not in the words, but in what we see when we allow ourselves to look, she said sweetly. Daniel arrived shortly after the show began. The gallery was full, but silent, as spaces where art breathes deeply tend to be. He walked slowly, stopping in front of each painting. The work spoke. Not with words, but with a language he understood. There was pain there, but also redemption. Recognition. Acceptance. Each painting seemed like an unfinished conversation, a sentence suspended in time. As he approached the last work, he paused for a moment longer. It was a self-portrait. But it wasn't Laura's face that filled the canvas. It was a blurred figure, with lines fading into paint, as if she were being erased little by little. In the corner, there was something handwritten, almost imperceptible, "I'm still painting myself." Laura appeared shortly after, with a firm but serene look. She was different. No longer fragile, nor desperate. Just real. When she saw him, she stopped for a second, then approached with calm steps. Daniel did not back away. The look between them was long, silent. She thanked him for coming. He replied that he needed to see. She nodded. "That was what I needed to talk about, but I couldn't." Daniel said he understood. And for the first time since the end, they smiled without weight. There were no promises, no questions. Just a moment of shared humanity between two who had loved and lost each other. Daniel didn't stay long. He said goodbye with a discreet wave, and when he went out into the street, he took a deep breath. The air that night seemed lighter, as if something inside him had finally settled. He walked back home with firm steps. When he arrived, Clara was waiting for him with 2 mugs of tea. "How was it?" she asked. He answered simply, "It was necessary." And as he sat next to her on the sofa, he felt that the cycle had finally come to a close. Laura, at the end of the exhibition, walked to the back patio of the gallery. She stood there alone for a few minutes, looking at the darkening sky. She didn't think of Daniel as an absence, but as part of the story that built who he was now. And that, despite everything, was beautiful. She knew that not all mistakes could be repaired. But she understood, clearly, that some mistakes can teach us to love better. Not always the other person, but ourselves. And in that moment, as she leaned against the cold wall and closed her eyes, she felt that she had started breathing again. In the following days, Daniel and Clara resumed their projects. They planned a short trip to a nearby village, far from everything, where they could walk slowly, cook together, and read in silence. They wanted to build something without ghosts. And they were doing it. Little by little, with love, with truth. One night, Daniel said softly while Clara slept next to him, "Thank you for not giving up on me." She, still with her eyes closed, replied, "Thank you for coming back to yourself." And so, life went on. Not as a story of reconciliation, but as a story of redemption. Of learning. Of pain that was overcome with courage. And above all, of love that, even when broken, taught us how to rebuild. Because some endings are, in fact, the beginning of something that could never have been born without the fall. And those who have the courage to get up, are the ones who discover the true value of loving again. The narrow road that led to the interior of the village seemed endless, surrounded by dry trees and the constant sound of the wind rustling the leaves. It was there that Daniel and Clara had chosen to spend some time away from everything, a break between the past that was finally ending and the present that they were asking for the chance to live fully. The small rented house had only 2 rooms, stone walls and large windows that generously let the sun invade every corner. The mornings began with coffee on the porch and books shared without haste, the days dragged on between trails and new recipes, and the nights, always calm, were lulled by the sound of crickets and the presence of 2 bodies that now knew the peace of belonging to themselves before anyone else. Daniel, amidst the simplicity of that place, felt something he had long forgotten, lightness. He was not a man seeking revenge, nor a survivor of pain. He was someone who had gone through emotional hell and now allowed himself to recognize small joys as proof that the soul can indeed heal. Clara realized this. She knew from the beginning that she was involved with someone who had already loved another woman deeply, someone who had been broken and who didn't promise the world. But what he offered now was more valuable: presence. There were no ghosts between them, only the awareness that everything they were building was being done with truth, and truth, even if simple, is what sustains a mature love. It was late one afternoon, while they were walking through a flowery field with the sky tinged with orange, that Daniel, almost without realizing it, spoke of the future. Not in far-fetched plans, but in simple questions, like, "Do you imagine yourself here with me more often?" Or, "Do you think you could live like this for a long time?" Clara answered with a smile that said more than any words. And he understood that he was ready. Ready to make room, not forgetting what he had lived, but respecting what was to come. On the other side, the gallery that Laura had opened with her exhibition had become a place for unexpected encounters. The impact of her works was greater than she had imagined. She received invitations for interviews, to participate in events, and even invitations from abroad. Art, which had previously been a personal refuge, had now become a bridge. But she chose to proceed with caution. She wanted to maintain control of her own pace. She was still afraid of losing her bearings, of getting carried away by euphoria and forgetting the woman who had learned to rebuild herself in solitude. She began to give workshops for women who had experienced losses, mourning, and breakups that had left scars. She did not speak openly about her own story, but in each class she shared the painful wisdom she had learned in silence. In one of these meetings, one of her students, in tears, confessed to having been betrayed after 20 years of marriage. Laura hugged her and said in a calm voice, "Pain does not define you. But what you are going to do with it does." And at that moment, he realized that perhaps what he had experienced had a greater purpose. Not to justify his mistakes, but to give meaning to what he had learned from them. One morning, when Laura opened her inbox, she found an unexpected email. It was from her father. Short and direct, as he always was. He said he missed her, that he had seen the report about her exhibition, and that he thought it might be time for them to talk more. Laura hesitated for several minutes. Then, she replied with an invitation for coffee. The reunion was tense at first, but soon calmed down. Her father, too proud to apologize in words, made a more meaningful gesture. He handed her an old notebook, with notes from family trips and forgotten photos. "Maybe it's good to remember where we came from, to understand where we went wrong," he said. Laura felt her eyes fill with tears. And in that notebook, she found an old photo in which she was with her parents and Daniel, all laughing on a beach. She smiled. Not with longing, but with gratitude. It was on a Sunday that Daniel and Clara decided to return home. The road seemed shorter, and the silence was now an accomplice, no longer an escape. When they arrived, they found the mail piled up, the routine calling them back, but also a letter on aged paper, delivered by hand. It was from Laura. A last contact. In it, Laura told him about the new phase, about how she transformed her pain into art and her art into bridges. She said she was happy that he had found peace. And she ended with a simple sentence, but full of truth: "We never go back to who we were. But we can choose to be better than we were." Daniel read it in silence, then showed it to Clara. She said nothing, just hugged him. And in that hug, he knew that this was the end of one story, but the real beginning of his. Months later, Daniel and Clara decided to move in together. The house was small, but full of windows and light. They bought used furniture, painted the walls in light colors, and planted a garden in the backyard. Each plant there seemed to grow as a symbol of what they were building, with firm roots, without haste, with care. One late afternoon, while watering the flowers, Clara said in a calm voice, "You seem at peace." Daniel replied, "I am. For the first time, I really am." And so, day after day, they wrote a new story. Not one of fairy tales, but of maturity, respect, and true love. Laura, in turn, began to travel frequently, taking her works to other states. But she always returned to her apartment, where she maintained a routine of simplicity and creation. One night, after finishing an intense class, she wrote in her diary, "It took me a while to understand that the greatest forgiveness is the one we give ourselves. But when it arrives, everything blossoms." She did not marry again, nor did she look for someone. She was content with herself. And that was enough. Because now, she understood that love is only possible when we have learned to love ourselves first. And so this story ended. With losses, yes. With deep pain, yes. But also with redemption. With growth. With the certainty that not every wound needs to be forgotten to stop hurting. Sometimes, it just needs to be accepted. And with that, the heart learns to beat again, with more truth, more strength and more wisdom. If you've come this far, with a heavy heart and a mind full of thoughts, tell us, what did you think of this story? Which character touched you the most? Would you have done things differently at any point? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, ever. This is a fictional story, but the pain it shows is real. And that's why it needs to be told. Betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys homes, dreams, and the trust that takes years to build, and can be thrown away in seconds. It leaves scars that not even time can completely erase. True love is built with daily choices, honesty, respect, and the courage to face even the hardest truths. And remember, cheating is always a choice. And every choice has a price.